When I got the job as a night guard at the Greenleaf Mall, it didn't feel like a big deal. I was desperate, after all. Rent was overdue. My car was barely clinging to life, and my credit card company was calling more often than my mom. It wasn't my dream job, but the ad said they were hiring immediately, and the pay was decent. Besides, who wouldn't want an easy gig sitting around at night? The interview process was strange, though. The hiring manager was an older guy named Mr. Anders. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. His tie was crooked, and the coffee stain on his shirt told me he didn't care much about first impressions. "So, you're interested in the position," he said, shuffling through a stack of papers that looked older than the mall itself. "Yes, sir. I'm a fast learner and dependable. I felt like I had to sell myself hard. Jobs like this didn't come easy in a town as small as ours." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're hired." "Wait, just like that?" He slid a clipboard across the table with a single sheet of paper attached to it. "Sign this, and if you have any sense, you'll follow the rules." I scanned the paper. The rules were handwritten, and not neatly. Some words were underlined multiple times, others circled, as if someone had been writing in a hurry. Rules for the night guard. Always arrive no later than 10 p.m. Do not enter the mall early. Lock the main doors behind you. If they're already locked, double-check. The cameras in hallway C will flicker between 11:30 p.m. and 11:45 p.m. Do not look directly at the monitor during this time. If you hear a baby crying, ignore it. Check the food court every hour. The chairs should always be stacked. If they aren't, stack them and leave immediately. Between 2 a.m. and 2:15 a.m., the escalators will start moving. Do not approach them. Never respond to someone knocking on the doors. There is no security staff outside after hours. When your shift ends at 6 a.m., leave immediately. Do not turn around, even if you hear your name. I stared at the list, waiting for Anders to laugh or explain that it was some kind of initiation joke, but he just stared back, his expression stone cold. "This is serious," he said, as if he could read my thoughts. "Follow the rules exactly, and you'll be fine. What happens if I don't?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You won't have to worry about that if you follow them." I didn't ask any more questions. Something about the way he spoke made it clear he wasn't in the mood for jokes or skepticism. I signed the paper, handed it back, and within minutes, I had my uniform, a flashlight, and a small key card for accessing the security office. My first shift started that same night. I arrived at 9:55 p.m., just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The parking lot was eerily empty, the streetlights casting long, uneven shadows on the cracked asphalt. Greenleaf Mall wasn't a big, flashy place. It was one of those dying malls that had seen its glory days in the 90s. Half the stores were vacant, their windows plastered with "For Lease" signs, and the ones that were still open were struggling. I parked close to the entrance, the silence of the lot pressing in on me. A single light flickered above the doors as I swiped my keycard and stepped inside. The mall was unnervingly quiet at night. No chatter, no music from the speakers, just the faint hum of the air conditioning system. The lights were dimmed, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly down the hallways. I made my way to the security office, a small room near the back of the mall filled with outdated equipment. The monitors were bulky, the kind you'd see in an old cop show, and the chairs looked like they'd been stolen from a thrift store. The first hour was uneventful. I spent most of it watching the monitors, flipping through the cameras. Hallway C was already giving me the creeps. The flickering hadn't started yet, but something about the way the shadows moved there seemed unnatural. At 11:30 p.m., the flickering began, just as the rules predicted. I averted my eyes, focusing instead on the clock mounted above the door. The flickering intensified, casting strange, erratic patterns on the walls. I could feel my curiosity bubbling up. What would happen if I looked? But Mr. Anders's warning replayed in my mind. Follow the rules. The flickering stopped at 11:45 p.m. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. At midnight, I decided to do my first round. The rules didn't say anything about specific patrols, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to walk the halls and familiarize myself with the place. The food court was my first stop. As expected, all the chairs were stacked neatly on the tables. I moved on, passing by rows of shuttered storefronts. The sound of my boots echoed loudly, making the empty mall feel even bigger. I was halfway back to the office when I heard it, a faint, high-pitched wail. I froze. The sound was unmistakable, a baby crying. My heart raced as I scanned the hallway. The sound was faint, almost like it was coming from far away, but it sent chills crawling up my spine. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The crying stopped. I stared down the darkened hallway, my flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of motion near the end of the hall, but when I shone my light there, it was empty. Remembering the rules, I forced myself to keep walking. My hands were clammy, and my pulse hammered in my ears. Back in the office, I locked the door and stared at the monitors. Hallway C was calm now, the flickering gone, but the rest of the mall felt wrong. It was as if the air itself had thickened, pressing down on me. As the hours dragged on, I found myself glancing at the clock more often. Midnight turned into 1 a.m., then 1:30. The rules were clear, but my nerves were fraying. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When 2 a.m. arrived, I kept my eyes glued to the monitors. And then, just as the rules said, the escalators began to move. When the escalators came to life at exactly 2 a.m., I almost laughed at how mundane it seemed. Of all the strange things the rules warned about, a moving set of stairs didn't seem particularly threatening. But as I stared at the monitors, the humor faded quickly. The escalators weren't just moving, they were moving too fast. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath fogging the old glass. The metal steps blurred as they sped up, faster than any escalator should be able to move. And then, I noticed something else. There were shadows on the steps. At first, I thought it was just an odd reflection, maybe a trick of the light. But the shadows didn't align with the rest of the scene. They didn't come from the escalator or any nearby objects. They were shapes, humanoid, but indistinct, shifting like smoke as they rode the steps up and down. My fingers hovered over the radio on my desk. I didn't even know who I'd call. Mr. Anders? The police? What would I even say? Help! The escalators are moving weirdly fast and there are shadows riding them? The rules had been clear. Do not approach the escalators between 2 a.m. and 2:15 a.m. So I didn't. But my curiosity gnawed at me. I watched the clock tick down, second by second. 2:10 a.m. The shadows continued their strange dance, flickering in and out of sight like faulty projections. One of them lingered, standing still at the base of the escalator, its head tilted as if it were staring directly at the camera. A chill ran down my spine. The longer I stared, the more distinct the shadow became. It wasn't just a silhouette anymore. I could make out the faintest hints of limbs, shoulders, and a head. I forced myself to look away. At exactly 2:15 a.m., the escalators stopped abruptly, the shadows vanishing with them. The silence that followed was deafening. I exhaled shakily, realizing I'd been holding my breath. My hands were clammy, and my legs felt like they'd turned to jelly. I wanted to tell myself it was just a malfunction, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. The rules weren't arbitrary. They were there for a reason. As 3 a.m. approached, I decided to do another round of the mall. Staying in the office felt safer, but something about sitting there, watching the monitors, was driving me insane. Every small flicker of motion made me jump, even when it turned out to be nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the hall, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the tiled floors. The mall felt different now, heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. The food court was my first stop. The chairs were unstacked. My stomach dropped. I distinctly remembered stacking them earlier in the night. The rules had been clear. The chairs should always be stacked. If they aren't, stack them and leave immediately. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam sweeping across empty tables and overturned chairs. There was no sign of anyone else. Okay, I muttered to myself, trying to keep calm. Just stack the chairs and get out. I moved quickly, placing the chairs back onto the tables as quietly as I could. The silence in the food court was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floor beneath my boots. As I stacked the last chair, I froze. From somewhere behind me, I heard a faint whisper. "Don't look." The voice was soft, barely audible, but it sent a jolt of fear through me. I spun around, my flashlight slicing through the darkness, but the food court was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I backed toward the exit, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't care what the voice was or where it had come from. I just wanted to get back to the office. As I reached the hallway, I caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision, a shadow darting across the far end of the food court. I didn't stop to investigate. I ran. When I slammed the office door shut behind me, I felt like I could finally breathe again. But the sense of safety didn't last long. The baby was crying again. The sound was faint at first, drifting through the walls like a distant memory. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the small office. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The cries seemed to echo from everywhere at once, surrounding me. Ignore it, I told myself. Just ignore it. But the crying sounded so real, so desperate. What if there really was a baby out there? I glanced at the monitors. The cameras showed nothing unusual, just empty hallways and shuttered stores. But the crying didn't stop. It grew sharper, more urgent, until it was almost unbearable. I stood, pacing the office, trying to drown out the noise with my own thoughts. But as I passed the door, I heard it, soft tapping, like tiny fingers against the glass. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The crying was louder now, right on the other side of the door. I could almost feel it, a tangible weight pressing against the thin barrier. "Hello?" I whispered. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the silence was almost worse. Then, a voice, small, fragile, and trembling, whispered through the door. "Please help me." Every fiber of my being told me not to open the door. The rules were clear. If you hear a baby crying, ignore it. But the voice sounded so real, so human. What if it was a child, lost and afraid? My hand reached for the lock, and then, as if on cue, the monitors flickered. I stood frozen, my hand inches from the lock. The baby's cries on the other side of the door shifted into soft, pleading whispers. "Help me," the voice said again, this time weaker, more desperate. The monitors in the security office flickered erratically, casting strobe-like flashes of light across the room. I tried to focus on the screens, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything, that might explain what was happening. But all I saw were empty hallways and dark storefronts. "Please," the voice whimpered. The rules echoed in my head like a siren. If you hear a baby crying, ignore it. But the longer I stood there, the harder it became to resist. What if the rules were wrong? What if someone was actually out there, in danger, and I did nothing? I tightened my grip on the doorknob, my knuckles whitening as I debated whether to open it. And then I noticed something on the monitors. On the feed from Hallway C, something moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I focused, I realized there was a figure standing just at the edge of the frame. It was tall and thin, its body shrouded in shadow. It didn't move. It didn't even seem to breathe. The baby's cries stopped abruptly. The figure turned its head toward the camera, as if it knew I was watching. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. When I glanced at the door, I noticed something else, a faint shadow beneath the crack, stretching toward me like a hand reaching under the door. "Help!" The voice came again, barely a whisper now. I backed away, my legs trembling. "This isn't real," I muttered to myself. "It's not real." The monitors flickered again, and when they stabilized, the figure was gone. For the next hour, I stayed in the office, staring at the screens. My flashlight sat on the desk, but I didn't dare touch it. Every creak of the building, every groan of the air ducts, made me jump. By 4 a.m., the mall had fallen into an eerie silence. Even the usual hum of the air conditioning seemed muted. And then, I heard it. A single, deliberate knock on the door. My body froze, and I felt my pulse in my ears. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. "You shouldn't be here," it said, deep and raspy. I grabbed the flashlight, pointing it at the door as if the thin beam could protect me. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. The monitors flickered again, and when the static cleared, hallway C came into view. The figure was back, standing closer this time, just outside the food court. I kept my eyes glued to the screen as it began to move, its steps slow and deliberate. I expected it to fade into the shadows again, but it didn't. Instead, it turned directly toward the nearest camera and stopped. Its head tilted, and though the image was grainy, I could see the faint outline of a face, or something that resembled one. "Leave," the voice rasped again, louder this time. I jumped to my feet, unsure of what to do. My instinct screamed at me to leave the office, but the rules were clear. Stay until your shift ends. Leave immediately at 6 a.m. I grabbed the key card from my pocket, holding it tightly as I tried to think. The knock came again, harder this time, shaking the door in its frame. "You shouldn't be here," the voice repeated, almost a growl now. And then, silence. I sat back down, keeping my eyes on the monitors. The figure was gone again, but hallway C seemed darker now, as if the shadows had deepened. I checked the other feeds, scanning for any signs of movement, but the rest of the mall was still. 5 a.m. couldn't come fast enough. Around 4:30, I heard footsteps in the hall outside the office. They were slow and heavy, the kind of footsteps that don't belong to someone in a hurry. I turned off the flashlight, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence. Then, I heard breathing. It was faint, but unmistakable. Long, raspy breaths, as if whoever was out there was struggling to breathe through damaged lungs. I held my own breath, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. "Leave," the voice rasped again, this time so close it felt like it was coming from inside the room. I whipped the flashlight around, scanning the dark corners of the office. There was no one there. The breathing stopped. I sat back down, my hands trembling as I checked the monitors again. Hallway C was empty, but the food court feed caught my attention. The chairs were unstacked. My stomach sank as I remembered the rule. The chairs should always be stacked. If they aren't, stack them and leave immediately. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Was this a test? A trap? The food court was on the opposite side of the mall, and I didn't know if I had the nerve to leave the office again. And then, the shadow returned. It moved across the food court, weaving between the tables like it was searching for something. As it reached the edge of the camera's view, it stopped, turning slowly toward the lens. The breathing returned, louder this time, echoing in the office. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing the key card, I bolted out of the office and into the hallway. The air felt heavier here, colder, as if the building itself were alive and pressing down on me. I made my way toward the food court, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The shadows seemed to shift around me, and every step felt like it took me farther from safety. When I reached the food court, the chairs were unstacked, just as I'd seen on the monitor. But I wasn't alone. The food court was deathly quiet as I stepped in, my flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the overturned chairs and empty tables. The air was cold, colder than it had been in the rest of the mall, and every breath I took clouded in front of me. The chairs were scattered, some lying on their sides, others knocked far from the tables like they'd been thrown. But the worst part wasn't the mess, it was the feeling that something was watching me. I moved quickly, stacking the chairs back onto the tables as quietly as I could. The rule was clear: stack the chairs and leave immediately. As I reached for a chair near the edge of the food court, my flashlight caught movement in the corner of my eye. I froze, my heart pounding. There, near the darkened entrance to the corridor leading to the service area, something shifted. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The only response was the sound of something dragging across the tiled floor, faint but deliberate. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and took a cautious step back. "If someone's there, I'm calling security," I bluffed, even though I knew I was the only one in the building. The dragging sound stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a whisper, soft, almost playful, drifted through the air. "You shouldn't be here." The voice wasn't human. It was distorted, layered, like multiple voices speaking at once. I turned toward the corridor, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, just empty space and the faint outline of a cleaning cart left abandoned near the wall. But then it stepped into the light. It was a shadow, a tall, humanoid shape that seemed to ripple and shift like smoke. Its edges weren't solid, constantly blurring and reforming as it moved. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. What do you want?" I managed to stammer. The shadow didn't answer. It simply stood there, motionless, as if waiting for something. I grabbed another chair and stacked it as quickly as I could, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped it. The rule was clear: stack the chairs and leave immediately. The shadow took a step closer, the sound of its movement like fabric brushing against stone. I stacked the last chair and turned to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I felt rooted to the spot, as if the air around me had turned to cement. "Leave," the voice whispered again, this time louder, almost angry. With every ounce of strength I had, I broke free from whatever was holding me in place and bolted toward the hallway. My footsteps echoed loudly in the empty mall, the sound mixing with the faint whispers that seemed to follow me. I didn't stop running until I was back in the security office. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The monitors flickered, the static washing over the screens like a wave. When the feed returned, the shadow was gone. I slumped into the chair, my mind racing. What the hell was that thing? I couldn't shake the image of its shifting form, the way it seemed to defy the laws of reality. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I kept my eyes glued to the monitors, too afraid to step outside the office again. Every creak of the building made me jump. Every flicker of the lights sent my heart racing. When the clock finally hit 6 a.m., I grabbed my things and bolted for the exit. The rules were clear. When your shift ends at 6 a.m., leave immediately. Do not turn around, even if you hear your name. As I stepped out into the cold morning air, I felt a strange sense of relief. The parking lot was bathed in pale sunlight, and for the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe again. But as I reached my car, I heard it. My name. "Eric," the voice called, soft and familiar. I froze, my hand on the door handle. It was my mother's voice. "Eric, wait," the voice said again, more insistent this time. I clenched my jaw, my heart pounding. The rules were clear. Do not turn around, even if you hear your name. "Eric, please." The voice sounded desperate now, almost panicked. I tightened my grip on the door handle, forcing myself to block out the sound. But then, a new voice joined in. "Eric, it's me, Kevin." Kevin had been my best friend in high school. He'd died 3 years ago in a car accident. My blood ran cold as the voices continued, overlapping and growing louder. They begged, pleaded, demanded that I turn around. But I didn't. I threw open the car door, climbed in, and started the engine. The voices followed me, their cries echoing in my ears as I sped out of the lot. When I finally got home, I collapsed onto the couch, my body trembling. I didn't sleep that day, or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow, heard the voices, felt the oppressive air of the mall. I called Mr. Anders and told him I couldn't come back. "Did you follow the rules?" he asked, his voice calm. "Yes," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was entirely true. "Then you'll be fine," he said. "Get some rest." But I wasn't fine, and rest was the last thing I got. Because that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard it. The whisper, "You shouldn't be here." I thought leaving the mall would put an end to the nightmare, but I was wrong. The first night after I quit, I stayed awake until sunrise, staring at my bedroom door as if something might walk through it. Every creak of the house made my stomach knot. Every shadow felt like it was watching me. But nothing happened. At least, not at first. By the third night, I was starting to think I'd imagined everything. Maybe the stress of the job had gotten to me. Maybe the strange occurrences were just coincidences, exaggerated by my lack of sleep. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. "You shouldn't be here." The whisper was faint, like it was coming from the far corner of the room. I sat up, my heart pounding as I scanned the darkness. My bedroom was silent, the faint glow of the street lamp outside casting pale light across the walls. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination and lay back down, but the unease didn't leave me. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. I hadn't slept well in weeks, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I spent the day running errands, hoping to distract myself, but everywhere I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At the grocery store, I caught glimpses of a tall, dark figure in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. At the gas station, the shadows beneath the awning seemed to shift unnaturally. And then, when I got home, I saw it. There, in the reflection of my living room window, was a shadow. It was tall and humanoid, standing perfectly still just behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing there. I checked every room, every closet, every corner, but my house was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. It clung to me like a second skin, weighing me down with every passing hour. That night, I barely slept. By the fifth night, the whispers were back. This time, they weren't confined to the far corners of the room. They were closer, circling me, their words overlapping and growing louder. "You shouldn't be here. Why didn't you follow the rules? Come back." I covered my ears, squeezing my eyes shut as I curled up on the bed. "Leave me alone," I screamed. The whispers stopped. When I opened my eyes, I saw it, the shadow, standing at the foot of my bed. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, its form rippling and shifting like smoke. I scrambled backward, nearly falling off the bed. "What do you want?" I shouted. The shadow tilted its head, and though it had no face, I felt its gaze bore into me. "You broke the rules," it whispered, the words echoing in my mind. "I didn't," I argued. "I followed them. I followed all of them." The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it began to dissolve, its form unraveling like threads in the wind. When it was gone, I sat in the dark, trembling and clutching the blanket like it was a shield. I couldn't stay here. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to leave me alone. The next morning, I drove straight to the mall. I hadn't been back since my last shift, and as I pulled into the parking lot, a wave of dread washed over me. The building loomed in the pale morning light, its windows dark and empty. I parked near the entrance and sat in the car, trying to summon the courage to go inside. Mr. Anders was in the security office when I found him. He looked up as I entered, his expression calm but weary. "I was wondering when you'd come back," he said. "What's happening to me?" I demanded, slamming my hands on the desk. "The rules, what are they for? What did I do wrong?" He leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying me. "The rules aren't just for your safety," he said. "They're to keep it contained." "Contained?" I repeated, my stomach twisting. He nodded. "The mall isn't like other places. It's connected to something else, something old and dangerous. If you follow the rules, you can navigate it safely. But if you break them—" "I didn't break them," I interrupted. "Are you sure?" he asked, his gaze piercing. I opened my mouth to argue but stopped. Had I broken a rule? I replayed the shifts in my mind, searching for any slip-up, no matter how small. What happens if I didn't follow them perfectly? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Then it follows you. It wants you to come back. And until you do, it won't stop." The room felt like it was closing in around me. "How do I fix this?" I asked. He stood, walking to the desk and pulling out a clipboard. On it was the same list of rules I'd signed before my first shift. "You have to come back," he said, sliding the clipboard toward me. "Take another shift. Follow the rules perfectly this time." I stared at the paper, my hands trembling. Every instinct in my body told me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I knew he was right. Whatever was haunting me wouldn't stop unless I did this. I signed the paper and handed it back to him. "When do I start?" I asked, my voice hollow. "Tonight," he said. I nodded, swallowing hard as I left the office. The rest of the day passed in a blur, my mind consumed by the thought of what awaited me that night. As 10 p.m. approached, I found myself standing at the mall's entrance once again, the key card clutched tightly in my hand. This time, I wasn't just a night guard. I was bait. Walking back into the mall that night felt like stepping into the jaws of a trap. The air was heavy with a strange, oppressive weight in every sound. My footsteps, the faint hum of the lights, seemed amplified in the silence. I arrived at 9:55 p.m., just as the rules dictated, and swiped my keycard at the entrance. The door unlocked with a mechanical click, and I stepped inside. The mall was exactly as I remembered. The dimmed lights, the faint scent of old wax from the floors, and the rows of shuttered stores that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. But this time, it felt different. As I made my way to the security office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to shift just out of sight, and the faint echoes of my footsteps sounded like they belonged to someone else. When I reached the office, I locked the door behind me and sat at the desk. The list of rules was already there, taped to the monitor. I read it over carefully, my fingers tracing the words as if committing them to memory all over again. 1. Always arrive no later than 10 p.m. Do not enter the mall early. 2. Lock the main doors behind you. If they're already locked, double-check. 3. The cameras in hallway C will flicker between 11:30 p.m. and 11:45 p.m. Do not look directly at the monitor during this time. The rest of the rules stared back at me like a taunt, daring me to make a mistake. 10 p.m. passed without incident. I kept my eyes glued to the monitors, scanning for any signs of movement. The flickering hadn't started yet, but the sight of hallway C was enough to make my skin crawl. It was darker than the other hallways, the shadows seeming to pool there like stagnant water. By 11:20 p.m., I was bracing myself for the flickering to begin. I turned my chair away from the monitor, focusing on the clock instead. When the first flicker hit, I clenched my fists, resisting the urge to look. The flickering intensified, the light and shadows dancing across the walls like some chaotic rhythm. And then, the whispers began. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the monitors. But as the flickering continued, the whispers grew louder, overlapping and echoing as if multiple voices were speaking at once. "Come back," they said. "You shouldn't be here." I pressed my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut as the whispers grew sharper, more insistent. "Turn around," one voice hissed. "No," I muttered under my breath. The flickering stopped abruptly, plunging the office into silence. I opened my eyes, my chest heaving. The clock read 11:46 p.m. I had made it. At midnight, I did my first round of the mall. The food court was my first stop, and I felt a wave of relief when I saw that the chairs were still stacked neatly on the tables. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like metal against tile. I turned back, my flashlight sweeping across the food court. The chairs were still stacked, but one of them was rocking slightly, as if it had just been moved. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The scraping sound stopped. I backed out of the food court, keeping my flashlight trained on the chairs until I was safely in the hallway. My next stop was hallway C. The air grew colder as I approached, my breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. The shadows here were darker, denser, as if they were trying to swallow the light. When I reached the midpoint of the hallway, I stopped. Something was wrong. The camera mounted on the wall was pointed downward, its red light blinking. I could have sworn it was pointed straight ahead earlier. A low, guttural growl echoed from somewhere behind me. I spun around, my flashlight slicing through the darkness, but the hallway was empty. The growl came again, closer this time. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It was deeper, more resonant, like it was coming from the walls themselves. "Keep walking," I whispered to myself, forcing my feet to move. The growl followed me, each step growing louder, until it felt like it was right on top of me. When I finally reached the end of the hallway, the sound stopped. I turned back, my heart pounding, and saw nothing. No shadows, no movement, just the empty hallway stretching back toward the food court. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. That's when I noticed it, a set of footprints in the dust, leading toward me. They weren't mine. The The footprints were larger, deeper, as if whatever had made them was far heavier than a person. They stopped just a few feet away, pointing directly at me. I didn't wait to see if the thing that made them was still nearby. I turned and ran back to the office, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. The monitors flickered again, and when the static cleared, the camera feed from hallway C showed the footprints. But they weren't pointing toward me anymore. They were leading away, disappearing into the shadows. For the next hour, I sat in the office, my eyes darting between the monitors and the clock. Every sound made me jump, every shadow seemed to move. At 2 a.m., the escalators came to life. The metal stairs moved faster than before, the whirring sound echoing through the mall. I kept my eyes on the monitors, watching as the shadows returned, riding the steps like silent passengers. And then, one of them stepped off. I stared at the monitor, my blood turning to ice. One of the shadows had stepped off the escalator. Unlike the others, which always seemed to shift and ripple like smoke, this one was more solid. It moved slowly, deliberately, making its way down the hallway toward the food court. My hand hovered over the radio. I didn't even know who I was thinking of calling. Mr. Anders? The police? What could I say? A shadow is walking through the mall. Please send help? But as I watched, the shadow stopped. It stood at the edge of the camera's frame, motionless. The faint red light from the exit sign overhead barely illuminated its shape, but I could tell it wasn't human. Its form was wrong. Elongated arms, a head that seemed too tall and narrow, and legs that bent at unnatural angles. For a moment, it felt like it was staring directly at the camera. Then it tilted its head, and though it had no face, I felt its gaze pierce through me. It was waiting. I backed away from the monitor, my legs shaking. Nope, I muttered under my breath. Not dealing with this. The rules were clear. Do not approach the escalators between 2 a.m. and 2:15 a.m. But they didn't say anything about what to do if one of the shadows left. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:06 a.m. 9 minutes left until the escalators stopped. The shadow moved again, this time toward hallway C. I watched as it disappeared from the camera's view, heading deeper into the mall. My heart raced as I flipped through the other feeds, trying to track its movement. In one frame, I saw it pause at a shuttered storefront. Its elongated arm reached out, pressing against the metal gate. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the gate began to rattle, shaking violently as if something on the other side was trying to get out. The shadow moved on, leaving the gate swinging slightly as it passed. I lost sight of it for a few minutes, the empty hallways on the monitors doing little to calm my nerves. Then it reappeared, this time, in the food court. It stood in the center of the room, surrounded by stacked chairs. The fluorescent lights flickered above it, casting erratic shadows on the walls. And then, one by one, the chairs began to fall. I watched, frozen, as the chairs toppled over, the sound echoing through the empty mall. The shadow didn't move, but it didn't have to. The rule rang in my head like a warning siren. The chairs should always be stacked. If they aren't, stack them and leave immediately. I didn't want to go back out there, but I knew I had no choice. The rules were clear, and breaking them wasn't an option. I grabbed my flashlight, took a deep breath, and stepped into the hallway. The mall was eerily quiet as I made my way toward the food court. My footsteps echoed loudly, the sound amplified by the emptiness around me. When I reached the food court, my stomach dropped. The chairs weren't just unstacked. They were scattered everywhere, some lying on their sides, others upside down. The shadow was gone, but the air felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I moved quickly, stacking the chairs as quietly as I could. My hands trembled, the weight of each chair feeling heavier than it should. As I stacked the last chair, I heard a faint whisper behind me. Leave. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The food court was empty. The whisper came again, softer this time, as if it were right next to my ear. Leave. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move. I turned and bolted back toward the security office, the sound of my footsteps drowned out by the whispers that seemed to follow me. When I reached the office, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The monitors flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw the shadow standing in hallway C again. But when the static cleared, the hallway was empty. The clock ticked slowly toward 3 a.m., and I stayed glued to the chair, watching the monitors like a hawk. My flashlight sat on the desk, the beam pointed at the door as if it could keep whatever was out there at bay. I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. At 3:12 a.m., the baby started crying again. The sound was faint at first, distant, as if it were coming from somewhere deep in the mall. But as the minutes passed, it grew louder, closer, until it felt like the cries were coming from just outside the office. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but the sound seemed to seep into my skull, drilling into my thoughts. "Make it stop," I whispered to myself. Then, the knocking started. It was soft at first, almost polite, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. "Eric," a voice called from the other side of the door. I froze. It was my mother's voice. "Eric, honey, please open the door." The rules rang in my head. Never respond to someone knocking on the doors. There is no security staff outside after hours. "Eric," the voice called again, softer this time. "It's me. Please, I need your help." Tears streamed down my face as I pressed my back against the far wall, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. "Go away," I shouted. The knocking stopped. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then, a single word came through the door, whispered so softly I almost missed it. "Come." The lights in the office flickered, and the monitors went black. I was alone in the dark, the whispers and cries fading into silence. And then I felt it. The air grew colder, heavier, and I knew. Whatever had stepped off the escalator hadn't left. It was here. The darkness in the security office was suffocating. The monitors were dead, their faint hum replaced by an oppressive silence. I fumbled for my flashlight, gripping it tightly as my heart hammered in my chest. The air had grown icy, my breath visible in the thin beam of light as I scanned the room. I didn't see anything, but I could feel it. The presence. It was here with me. The silence was shattered by a single, deliberate knock on the door. My body froze, every muscle tensing as the sound echoed in the small office. The knock came again, louder this time. "Eric," a voice called, low and distorted. "Open the door." It wasn't my mother's voice anymore. It wasn't anyone's voice I recognized. The rules were clear. Do not respond to someone knocking on the doors. There is no security staff outside after hours. I stayed rooted to the spot, the flashlight trembling in my hand as the knocking grew more frantic. The door rattled in its frame, as if something on the other side was trying to force its way in. "Eric," the voice said again, sharper this time. "Let me in." I took a step back, my eyes darting toward the monitors in a desperate hope they would come back to life. But they remained black, the room bathed in darkness. "Go away," I shouted, my voice cracking. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I stood there, my back pressed against the far wall, straining to hear anything beyond the pounding of my own heartbeat. And then, I heard it. A faint, scraping sound. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the ceiling. I tilted my flashlight upward, the beam cutting through the dark. The ceiling tiles above the desk were shifting, as if something was moving across them. Dust rained down, the soft patter against the floor magnified in the stillness. "Don't look," a voice whispered. I froze. The voice wasn't coming from outside the room. It was inside, right behind me. Slowly, I turned, my flashlight casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The office was empty, or at least it looked empty, but the air felt heavier now, charged with something unseen. "Don't look," the voice repeated, louder this time. I spun back toward the door, my chest heaving as panic set in. The scraping on the ceiling grew louder, more frantic, and I realized with dawning horror that whatever was up there was trying to get in. The tile above the desk gave way with a sudden, deafening crash. I screamed, stumbling backward as a thick, black shadow spilled into the room, writhing and shifting like smoke. The flashlight in my hand flickered, its beam barely cutting through the darkness as the shadow began to take shape. It was tall, its limbs elongated and twisted at unnatural angles. Its head tilted toward me, featureless yet somehow filled with malice. "You broke the rules," it rasped, its voice layered and echoing as if spoken by 1,000 voices at once. I stumbled back, pressing myself against the wall. "I didn't," I shouted, my voice trembling. The shadow moved closer, its form shifting and rippling as it filled the room. "You did," it hissed. "And now, you belong to me." "No," I screamed, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. "Stay back." The shadow paused, its head tilting again as if studying me. "Run," it said, its voice a whisper that slithered into my ears. Without thinking, I bolted for the door, throwing it open and sprinting into the hallway. The mall was eerily silent, the faint hum of the lights barely audible over the sound of my own panicked breaths. The rules were gone from my mind now. I wasn't thinking about them, wasn't following them. All I could think about was getting out. I raced toward the main entrance, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty halls. Behind me, I could hear the shadow following, its movements a low, guttural rumble that reverberated through the walls. As I rounded a corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The escalators were moving again. The rule burned in my mind: do not approach the escalators between 2 a.m. and 2:15 a.m. But it was well past 3 a.m. now. Why were they moving? At the base of the escalator, the shadows were gathered, their forms twisting and blending together like a living, breathing mass. They were waiting for me. "Eric," the voice called again, this time from the shadows themselves. "Come, it's time." I backed away, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as my hands shook. "I don't belong to you," I shouted. The shadows seemed to ripple at my words, their forms writhing as if in response to my defiance. "You broke the rules," they said in unison, their voices blending into a terrible, guttural chorus. I turned and ran, the sound of the shadows following close behind. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. The mall felt endless now, its familiar layout twisted into something unfamiliar and nightmarish. Every turn led me deeper into the maze, the walls closing in as the whispers grew louder. "You can't escape," the voices taunted. "You belong to us." I burst into the food court, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The chairs were unstacked again, scattered across the room in disarray. The air here was even colder, each breath burning in my lungs as I tried to steady myself. The shadows were close now, their forms spilling into the edges of the room like an encroaching tide. I grabbed a chair, hurling it toward the mass of darkness. "Stay away from me," I screamed. The chair vanished into the shadows without a sound. The mass shifted, separating into individual forms that moved toward me in unison. I backed into a corner, my flashlight flickering weakly as I tried to think of a way out. And then, in the center of the room, one of the shadows spoke. "Follow the rules," it said, its voice soft but filled with an undeniable authority. "Follow them, and you might live." The flashlight in my hand went out. I was plunged into darkness. The darkness was absolute, swallowing me whole. My flashlight was dead, its weak beam snuffed out as if the shadows had consumed it. The whispering voices surrounded me, overlapping in a chaotic symphony. "Follow the rules," they hissed, "or stay with us." My breathing was ragged, my chest heaving as panic set in. I pressed myself against the wall, my mind racing. What rule had I broken? What mistake had I made to bring this upon myself? And then it hit me. The chair. I hadn't stacked the chairs the first time I saw them unstacked in the food court. I'd run, leaving the rule broken. My heart sank as I realized the truth. This wasn't just about following rules. It was about fixing what you'd broken. "I'll fix it," I shouted into the darkness. "I'll stack them. Just let me go." The whispering stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Then, a single voice spoke, soft and slow. "Prove it." The room exploded with sound. Chairs clattered to the ground, their metal legs scraping against the tile. I flinched, covering my ears as the noise grew louder, more chaotic. When it finally stopped, the flashlight in my hand flickered back to life. I was alone in the food court again. The chairs were scattered across the room, more disorganized than before. Some were toppled over, others turned upside down, their legs jutting into the air like skeletal limbs. The shadows were gone, but their presence lingered, thick and suffocating. I moved quickly, stacking the chairs as fast as I could. My hands shook, the metal cold against my fingers as I lifted each chair into place. With every chair I stacked, the air grew heavier, pressing down on me like an invisible force. My legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but I didn't stop. When I placed the final chair on the table, the oppressive weight lifted. I let out a shaky breath, wiping the sweat from my brow. But then I heard it, a slow, deliberate clap. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the room. Standing at the far end of the food court was a figure. It wasn't a shadow this time. It was solid, tangible. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned security uniform. Its face was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were hollow voids that seemed to drink in the light. "Well done," it said, its voice smooth and low. "But you're not finished. What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty space. The figure tilted its head, a small smile playing on its lips. "The rules must be upheld," it said. "Even now." It stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth, like it was gliding across the floor. "You've made mistakes, Eric. You've broken what was meant to keep you safe." "I fixed it," I argued, pointing to the stacked chairs. "I followed the rules." The figure stopped, its hollow eyes boring into mine. "You followed some," it said, "but not all." The temperature in the room dropped again, my breath clouding in the air as the lights flickered above me. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the hallway that led back to hallway C. "You have one last chance," it said. "Go, and do not falter." I hesitated, my legs frozen in place. The hallway was dark, the shadows twisting and shifting like living things. "Go," the figure repeated, its voice sharper now, "or you'll stay here forever." With no other choice, I turned and made my way toward the hallway. My flashlight flickered again, its beam barely illuminating the path ahead. The further I went, the colder it became. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against me like a living thing. When I reached hallway C, I stopped. The camera was still tilted downward, its red light blinking faintly. The shadows here were thicker, pooling like liquid on the floor. And at the far end of the hall, the figure was waiting. It was different from the one in the food court. This one was taller, its form more distorted, as if it was barely holding itself together. Its head tilted toward me, and though it had no face, I felt its gaze. "Fix it," it rasped. "Fix what?" I shouted, my voice echoing down the empty hallway. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the ground. I looked down and felt my stomach drop. The footprints were back. They were deep and deliberate, leading toward me before stopping just a few feet away. But now, there were more of them, branching off in multiple directions like a web. I followed the tracks with my flashlight, my pulse racing as I realized where they led. To every corner of the mall. "Fix it," the figure repeated, its voice more insistent now. My mind raced. What was I supposed to fix? The rules. The rules had always been the key. I had to follow them perfectly, no matter what. I turned back toward the food court, but the figure stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "No," it said. "This is where it ends." The shadows surged forward, their forms coalescing into a massive, writhing mass that filled the hallway. The figure stood at the center, its hollow eyes glowing faintly as it extended a hand toward me. "Follow the rules," it whispered one last time. And then, the lights went out. The darkness was complete, pressing in on me from all sides. The air felt heavy, almost unbreathable, as the writhing shadows closed in. The figure with hollow eyes stood motionless in the center, its hands still extended toward me. "Follow the rules," it whispered again, its voice 1,000 layers of sound. My legs felt like they were sinking into the ground, the weight of the shadows pulling me down. I gripped the flashlight tighter, even though its beam was useless now. My mind raced, replaying every rule, every mistake. I had to fix it. "I'll follow the rules." I shouted into the void. I'll do whatever you want. The shadows stopped their advance. The figure tilted its head, studying me. You already broke them, it said. You can't undo what's done. But I fixed the chairs. I argued, desperation clawing at my throat. I followed the rules after that. The figure's hollow eyes seemed to burn brighter. The rules are not about fixing mistakes, it said. They're about preventing them. My heart sank as the weight of its words hit me. I hadn't been careful enough. The first mistake had been stacking the chairs late. The second had been losing my nerve and running. Every misstep, no matter how small, had added up to this. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The figure stepped closer, its distorted form towering over me. Now, you pay the price. I stumbled back, my breath hitching as the shadows surged forward again. They wrapped around me like tendrils, cold and suffocating, pulling me toward the ground. No, I screamed, struggling against the force. Please, I can fix this. I can do better. But the shadows didn't stop. And then, everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the security office. The monitors were on, their feeds displaying empty hallways. The clock on the wall read 5:59 a.m. I sat up, my body aching as if I'd been crushed under a heavy weight. For a moment, I thought it was over, that somehow I'd been given another chance. But then I noticed the rules. The list was different now. The paper was still taped to the monitor, but the handwriting had changed. It was jagged, almost illegible, as if written in a frenzy. And at the bottom of the list, a new rule had been added. 9. The mall will never let you leave. You work here now. Forever. Panic set in as I bolted for the door. The hallways were still dimly lit, the familiar hum of the lights echoing in the silence. I ran toward the main entrance, my footsteps loud and frantic against the tiled floor. But when I reached the doors, they wouldn't open. I slammed my fists against the glass, shouting for help, but the parking lot outside was empty. The sun was rising, casting its light across the asphalt, but I couldn't reach it. Behind me, the whispers began again. I turned, my back pressed against the door as the shadows began to gather in the hallway. The figure with hollow eyes stood among them, its form more distinct now, almost human. You belong to us, it said, its voice calm, almost soothing. This is your place. No, I screamed, banging on the doors until my hands ached. I'm not staying here. But the shadows surged forward, engulfing me in their cold embrace. The next thing I remember is waking up in the security office again. The clock read 10 p.m., the start of another shift. The list of rules was taped to the monitor, the new rule glaring back at me like a death sentence. No matter how many times I tried to escape, I always ended up back here, starting the night over. The mall wouldn't let me leave. To this day, I don't know if I'm alive or dead, or if it even matters. The shifts blur together, each one a repeat of the last, with the same rules and the same haunting presence watching my every move. If you ever see a job posting for a night guard at a mall, don't take it. No matter how desperate you are, no matter how tempting the pay, because once you start, you can never stop, and the mall will never let you go.